This time it's 5 classic Italian 750s. These days we live in a world where litre sports bikes dominate the sports bike category. But in the years before the millennium, 750cc was the capacity to have if you were a serious sports bike fanatic. While there were litre class bikes, these were generally considered rather lardy compared to the nifty and sporty 750. And so here are 5 classic Italian 750s. The Benelli Sei. On its launch in 1974, Benelli's Sei 750 became the world's first 6-cylinder motorcycle. And the Sei combined that glamorous engine with a high-quality chassis and cycle parts. Its 748cc single overhead cam engine ran a bore and stroke of 56 by 50.6. Performance was generally described as rather modest, relatively speaking, at 71 horsepower at 8,500 rpm. And when fed through the 5-speed gearbox, it was enough to push the 484 pounds or 220 kilo bike along at around 115 miles an hour. And although the bike was smooth and sophisticated, this meant that performance was little better than a Triumph Bonneville T140. And of course, being glamorous and Italian meant that it was very expensive. Sales, not surprisingly, were very slow, but there was no doubt in the bike's glamour. 6 exhausts poking out of the side, disc brakes all round, although strangely just the 3 carburettors, one for every 2 cylinders. This did have the effect of dampening the performance slightly, but it also meant that the bike was a little bit narrower, so the carburettors did not get in the way of the rider's knees. And so with sales continuing to disappoint, Benelli enlarged the engine out to 900cc's. This machine may have had more power and was an all-round better performer, but it still was a very slow seller. It would survive into the 1980s, but would never achieve the sales success its designers had hoped for it. The Laverda 750 range. Laverda's 750 range was born from a visit by General Manager Massimo Laverda to the US in 1964. Because before that point, Laverda was best known for the production of small capacity motorcycles. But he realised whilst there that if the company was going to thrive, it was going to need to produce a larger capacity motorcycle. And so Massimo would purchase 3 motorcycles, a Norton 650 SS, a BMW R69S and a Honda CB77. He then commissioned his designer Luciano Zen to come up with an engine concept. He designed a 650 engine which was heavily, visually at least, based on the Honda CB77, around which he designed their own spine frame. The prototype was shown at the 66 Earls Court show, where it caught the eye of American importer Jack McCormick, who strongly suggested that the factory enlarge the engine out to 750. Another change was the move from a 180 to a 360 crank spacing. This would improve smoothness at low RPM and torque delivery too. The first production model would arrive in 1968. This was the Touring GT model, which produced around 52 horsepower claimed. And this was joined a year later by the 750S, which made 60 horsepower. But this machine would only last a year before being replaced by the 750 SF, or Super Freni. That means super brakes. How many bikes do you know that are actually named after their brakes? And with its massive 230mm or 9.1-inch twin leading shoe front brakes, you can see why. 1973 would see a further upgrade to 66 horsepower for the SF1, which employed Delauto pump carburetors. This model would be replaced by the SF2 in 1974, which although retained the drum brake at the rear, now employed twin discs at the front. But while early models initially just had a single disc, given the weight and performance of the machine, it's not surprising that they quickly upgraded. The final production model was the SF3. This was released in 1976 and employed disc brakes all round, and also had a fiberglass cowl over the back seat. But perhaps the best known model is the SFC, or Super Freni Competizione, essentially an endurance racer built in small numbers of around 549 units in total. The machine is noted for its half-fairing and extremely powerful engine with just over 70 horsepower on tap, not bad for the 750 twin of the era. The final touring model was the GTL. Introduced in 1974, it used a GT engine in SF cycle parts, and this machine would run until the end of production in 1977 and was a popular choice for many Italian police forces. The Ducati 750 F1. Now I expect most people would have thought that I was going to include the bevel drive 750 Sport. There's no way I'm going to be that predictable, so instead I'm going to plumb for a belt drive 750 instead, and that is the 750 F1. Now this machine is an evolution of the earlier Panther range of 500 and 650cc motors, which were in turn a development of the last 500cc Ducati Grand Prix races from 1973. The Panther 500 would arrive in 1979 at the Milan show and was notable for its use of a belt single overhead cam engine rather than the bevel drive system used on previous models. Designed by Fabio Taglioni, the machine will form the basis for all subsequent Ducati V twins. Ducati soon realised the competition potential of the engine and expanded it out to 583cc for a TT2 racer, before later tuning the 650 engine to enable it to compete in the 750 class. But then in 1985, Ducati took the frame designed for the Panther 500 racer but fitted it with an enlarged 750 version of the Panther engine for the road, thus creating the 750 F1, a precursor to the later SS models and of course the 851 and onwards racing bikes. The engine was of 748cc with a bore and stroke of 88 by 61.5. The machine had 2 valves per cylinder with desmodronic valve actuation, 36mm Delorta carburetors, and was said to produce around 75 horsepower. The machine was extremely agile, weighing in at just 175 kilos or 386 pounds, and a top speed of around 125 miles an hour in stock trim. And this truly beautiful machine would form the basis for later competition machines, but would also form the starting point for the later air-cooled SS models arriving at the end of the 80s. The Moto Guzzi 750S. The story of the 750S really begins in the late 60s with the introduction of Giulio Colcano's V7 touring bike. But it was the arrival of Bruno Tonti in 1969 that really changed the direction for the V7. He designed an all-new frame which was much more rigid and compact. He then fitted the machine with a tuned version of the V7 engine and added a touch of styling to create the V7 Sport, a machine that on release caused a sensation in the early 70s. Conti had designed the bike to go racing, but to do so he would need to produce at least 100 motorcycles for homologation purposes. But initially the management balked at the idea, but they eventually relented when Tonti threatened to resign. And Tonti was indeed vindicated when the V7 scored a podium finish its first time out at the Bol d'Or. And in a 1972 road test, the production version of the bike proved to be the fastest 750 on test. When Motociclismo in Italy ran a comparison test, the machine had a top speed of 125 miles an hour and proved faster than both the CB750 and a Kawasaki H2 also on the test. And when the test moved to the Monza circuit, the machine lapped comfortably quicker than any of the other 750s, including a Ducati GT750 and a Laverde SF750. But the V7 was horrendously expensive to build, using gear-driven cams and various other features which were complex and difficult to manufacture. And so 1975 would see the introduction of the 750S. This was much less expensive to build and now featured all-round disc brakes, drum brakes now being seen as somewhat obsolete by 1974. And importantly, this machine would also see a move of the gear change to the left-hand side. The final version of the 750 Sport was the S3 of 1975. And this machine was unfortunately a victim of the cost-cutting efforts of the Di Tommaso era, running essentially an 850 T3 touring engine that was sleeved down, and in a fairly mild camshaft, and what you got was a machine with far less performance than the earlier models, with the machine hitting just 115 miles an hour on test, some 10 miles an hour slower than the V7 had been just 3 years earlier. But the days of the sporting 750 Moto Guzzi were nearing a close. The first Le Mans 850 prototype had been spied testing as early as 1972, so it was no great surprise in 1976 when the 750 was gone and the 850 Le Mans had taken its place at the top of the sporting range. the MVgusta 750S. With a record of 37 Grand Prix world titles under their belts, MVgusta is probably the most successful Grand Prix team of all time. But at the same time, their road-go machines of the 50s and 60s were usually relatively small displacement, with engines no bigger than 350cc, with 125 and 175cc bikes being the most common. But throughout the 60s, Count Domenico Augusta found himself under constant pressure to build a road-going version of their Grand Prix bikes. He would eventually relent and allow the designers to build a 600cc touring bike with 4 cylinders, but the bike had shaft drive, was aesthetically challenged to say the least, and had fairly modest performance. And it surprised nobody, with the possible exception of MVgusta themselves, that the bike was not a big seller. Frankly, that's not what people expected from an MV4. They wanted something with rather more excitement. And in 1973 they got it. While the new bike was still shaft drive, the engine had now been enlarged out to 743cc. And more importantly this time, the machine was exquisite. Right from its beautiful styling through to its Magni design frame. With its gear-driven dual overhead cams, the engine was clearly based on that of the earlier Tourer, but high compression pistons, free flow exhaust and larger carburetors ensured that performance was somewhat better, with MV claiming peak power at 65 horsepower. Despite this, top speed was somewhat disappointing when measured at just 115 miles an hour, so somewhat slower than Moto Guzzi's V7 Sport. The chassis, however, whilst heavy at 506 pounds or 230 kilos, but was extremely competent, allowing the machine to outhandle all Japanese rivals of the period. To help close the performance gap against its Japanese opposition, the 750S America was created. This had the engine bored out by 2mm to give a capacity of 789cc. This engine ran a boring stroke of 67 by 56 and had 26mm carburetors. Peak power was claimed at 75 horsepower and top speed was in the region of 130 miles an hour. But even this mighty beast wasn't enough to save the company, and in 1977 they went into liquidation, although there would be limited production runs of engines of 800 and 850cc right through until 1982. Whatever bikes or collections of bikes would you like to see a future video on? Perhaps you've got a bike available for test ride. Either way, get in touch below. Hope you enjoyed that video. If you did, don't forget to like and subscribe, and of course thank you very much for watching.